Hello, guys. Welcome to Psyched Minds. If you have not subscribed yet to the channel, do subscribe, like, and share if you like the content. We are reading In Therapy by Susie Orbach, Case of Maureen, page number 140. Maureen is 75. She's been a carer for her mother, nursing her through Parkinson's. Recently, she's been looking after her husband, who has dementia. She wears a drindle skirt, her soft pink blouse, and pink trainers. Her white hair, blue eyes, and tiny lined face is lively. She speaks softly as though telling secrets. It is her fifth session. Susie, hello. Maureen, hello. It's Maureen Ellis. Susie, come on in. Maureen, thank you. Nice to see you again. Susie, you too. Maureen, I don't really know where to start today because I had a phone call this morning from Guy. I don't know whether I told you about him. I met him when I went dancing. I started a dance class actually. I used to love dancing and I just got go once a week and I met this man guy who is very, very nice and Susie, Maureen. He asked me out to dinner and I don't know what to do. I don't I don't know whether to go. Susie, do you know what you would like to do? Maureen, well, part of me would love to go. I mean, I don't know whether I told you, Susie, but it's sort of embarrassing at my age. But when I was dancing with him, I suddenly felt young again. I felt just me, and it was wonderful. He's very tall, and I have had a knee replacement, so I can do things I couldn't do before. And I sort of whizzed around, and I did feel wonderful, like a person again. And I realized I haven't been a person. When you care for somebody, you are a person, but you lose, or I felt I had lost my identity. Susie, uh huh. Maureen, at certain points, I did get my confidence again when I was sort of taking care of him, and we became a bit close at the beginning of his dementia, but then as it goes on, pauses and sighs. Hmm. Sorry, it is getting so hard visiting him. I visited him on Sunday, and he was in a very bad place, and he just makes these awful sounds now, and he's now being put in a dementia home. He's been taken away from this nice place near where I live, but being put in this place, and it's horrid. It smells, and to see him, who was so alive. Tom used to be so alive, so funny and big and extraordinary, and so that's just. I'm sorry, I'm rambling a bit. I know, but this phone call has sort of put me in a bit of a position because yes, to answer your question, I would love to go for dinner. But I'm also scared to go to dinner. I haven't been out. Susie, uh-huh. Maureen, I do my evening class, but I haven't been actually out. When you are dancing, you are with a lot of people. He's got a wife with MS who is in a home. I have a feeling there's something there. Susie, uh-huh. Maureen, am I allowed to hope to live? Susie, your eyes are shining and you are smiling. And why shouldn't you have companionship and interest? You aren't walking down the aisle yet. Could you explore going out for dinner? Maureen, actually, you are right. You are right. I'm so aware of the judgments of Tom's friends and my daughter who sort of goes on at me for not doing more and I wouldn't be able to tell her. Susie, you don't need to tell anybody. Maureen, I don't need to tell anybody, do I? Just go and go home after. Susie, you didn't ask for permission to take your course. Your humanities course at Birkbeck? Maureen, no, I didn't. Susie, you didn't ask for permission to go dancing? Maureen, that was me, wasn't it? Susie, yeah, and you found people to share the developing bits of your life? Maureen, yes, to meet people who have the same kind of guilt of, you know what I mean? Susie, it's a very cruel situation, isn't it? Because you lived your life. Maureen, with somebody, yeah. Susie, with somebody, and then you lose them. Maureen, and you do lose them because They are not there, Susie. And you had this moment when you connected in a way that was post children, when he was first diagnosed, that was so alive, and then lost him again. You really lost him, and you didn't even have that old relationship where you just knew each other. Understandably, it's going to produce difficulties inside of you, confusion, maybe guilt, children, daughter banging on at you, your friends really not knowing what to say or what to do. Your dilemma is to hold all of them, but also to take up what you have been interested in, which is Maureen, life. Susie, exactly. Life, the reading, the dancing. Maureen, life. It helps me to hear you saying, Maureen, you did your dancing, you did choose to study. I did. But you kind of forget yourself. Do you know what I mean? That it was you who did these things. Susie, yes, nobody told you to go and do a master's at Birkbeck. You were the one who said, I want to do this. Maureen, yeah, yeah. Susie, you walked yourself in there. Maureen, yes, and I feel alive. My brain feels alive, and I think when you are caring for somebody with dementia, you spend so much time trying to understand them that your own brain feels as though it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and you're terrified that you might go the same way. Susie, yes. Maureen, if you don't fight to break out. About 4 months ago, I went to see Tom, who just makes these noises, which are awful, and he was making them. I had missed 2 weeks because I had actually had my knee replacement. Susie, Maureen, and I won't do the sounds because they disturb me, but he suddenly said, I've been waiting for you for a very, very long time. Susie, yes. Maureen, and he spoke words, and it was like a light. If a light is flickering and then it's dead, you know that. But when he said that, I thought there is that light again because I want to understand this dementia. Does that mean that those words, I've been waiting for you for a very, very long time, are underneath all the time? Do they understand? It was really upsetting. Susie, I think what you are describing is flashes of presence. Maureen, um, Susie, emotional presence, but Maureen, it is like just a faulty light bulb. Susie, I think emotionally it is like that for you, and that's all we can really work with. You find it hard to be sitting there with Tom with the sounds and no connection. Maureen, yeah. Susie, which is perhaps what your daughter keeps implying. Maureen, well, she thinks if I visited him more often, he would remember me more. My face would be there, but I have been told by the staff, which does help me, that in fact this sounds so ironic. But the fact is, when I go, he's sometimes more upset after because he does remember something. Whereas if there is just a period of not me, there's this sort of, I don't know whether he goes on to this plateau where nothing is interfering with his, I don't know. Susie, I think it is hard to know, and they have got much more experience. The painful question is what you can manage. Maureen, yeah. Susie, and it seems as though you can usually manage to go a couple of times a week. Maureen, yeah. Susie, and yes, there was a respite for you while you were dealing with your own knee. The hard bit is seeing what can work for you. Maureen, yeah, and I really need to study myself as much as I study a book. Susie, Maureen, or a thesis, or try to understand myself because I have found for ages you've got such a routine treadmill. You just do things without thinking, and now it is helping me to come to you and realize what I'm thinking, and also to be able to talk. Susie, Maureen, and to be heard actually. You hear what I say. Susie, Maureen, I know that you do it all the time. Susie, Maureen, I mean, that's your job, isn't it? But very rarely in life do people actually hear what you are saying. Susie, well, it's a dual thing. If you are heard, you can hear yourself. Maureen, absolutely, and have time to realize where you are. I've come now. I'm 75, I come now, And I'm thinking these things, and you think back on all the years where maybe you haven't listened to people, haven't been heard. Why do you have to wait until you are very old, very, very old, before you come to a realization like this? Or you have been through hell and high water? Maureen is talking about a cultural phenomena in which self-reflection or examination is not part of what we do, and the sadness she feels about having missed such personal contemplation. I'm also thinking of Maureen in her historical moment as mother, wife, daughter, and carer in all these aspects of her life, and how she finally has a space to feel her own interest outside of the family. Because she isn't attending to others on a day to day basis, she has the chance to hear her own desires and feelings. Her radar is not continually tuned to others. Susie. Well, I'm not sure the important thing is the why. The important thing is that you are. Marine. Yeah. Susie. One of the things I was thinking about from our last conversation is having looked after your mother, who got Parkinson's at a very early stage, and you wanted to look after her. It wasn't Maureen. I did. I really loved her. Susie. That's it. And then meeting Tom shortly after, it meant that your ways of being got dragged in a particular way. Maureen. Yes, yes. Susie. And I suppose what you have been able to do now is maybe pick up the things that you thought you wanted to do when you were younger that have stayed with you. Maureen. Absolutely. And Susie. So it is the intellectual activity, but it is also finding a voice, finding a self post children. Maureen. Yes, well, there's a strange thing that happens when you get older, which is that you are very present with yourself as a child, your memories of your mother and your father, and feelings of what you felt first. First felt like first love, or you sort of go back to that. You're very close to being a child. I don't know if I'm saying this properly, but it's all very vivid. And I suppose when you grow up and you're coping, as you say, with these things like looking after your mother, marriage, and children, you are just getting on. Your whole life is scarce. And as you get older, I've only got what, 10 years, 15 years at the most. I've got to make the most of them. Susie. But is it possible that what you are saying is that apart from the memories, what you have captured for yourself is this incredibly precious quality of your essence? Maureen. Yeah, your essence, yes. Susie. Very alive? Maureen. Yes, sometimes if you go to a funeral of somebody. Susie. Uh-huh. Marine, and they talk about somebody's whole life and that person who you have lost. They sort of talk about the driving force that person had. And sometimes, if it's a good service, you think, oh, that was the essence of them. That was the root core of their being. Susie. Uh huh. Maureen. And that's what you sort of realize as you get older. That was who I was. Susie. Uh huh. Maureen. I can remember a picture of when I was very small and I was on a beach with my sister. I was very happy and I just had my arms around her, and I can now envisage that and get that wonderful feeling of no responsibility, just being one with the sun and the sea. Susie. Uh huh. Maureen. I suppose ideally, if Guy, instead of a meal, if we just went for a walk by the sea, that would be just brilliant. Maybe if I go to dinner, I could suggest that next time. Susie. Uh huh. Marine. Do you know about recapturing something of the past? Susie. You mean recapturing the innocence or the pleasure of the past but being in the present? Marine. Yeah, just being with one with the sea. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Susie. You look at me like it is a little bit naughty, a little bit with sort of Maureen. I feel it because I feel it is because Susie. It's sort of excited naughty. Maureen. It is. It's a hoping and then feeling there's naughtiness. It's at the same time seeing my husband completely nothing, nowhere, in a kind of hell, and I just find it. That's the problem. That's the sort of that image of where he is, and me going off. Susie, well, maybe that's why you have images of childhood. Maureen, yes. Susie, because it removes you from that anguish, whereas actually you are a woman of 75. Maureen, yeah. Susie, with a husband. Maureen, yeah. Susie, who has left, to all intents and purposes. Maureen, um, Susie, so you are actually way past childhood and way past raising children together with him and having a life. Maureen, um, Susie, and you have got a lot of sorrow and loss, but you have also got something else coming in. Maureen, I know. I see where you are coming. You are saying grow up and stop being a child. Susie, I'm saying what is emanating from you is the excitement emerging from a 75-year-old woman who has lived a life. Maureen, yes, yes. Susie, of course it has echoes of childhood, but it isn't a return or a replay. Maureen, yes, yes, it isn't. It isn't. Susie, it isn't because it is. Maureen, what it is. Susie, it is what it is, and it's inflected or it's saturated with your history. Maureen, yeah. Susie, and your present, which is not so easy, but it isn't only not easy, it has also got pleasures in it. Maureen, and he too, Guy, I mean, I know with his wife with MS, he's probably has very similar feelings too, you know. And you need love in order to live, don't you? Susie, uh huh. Maureen, to go on because there isn't anything else, is there? Susie, so you think you might allow yourself to. Maureen, well, I tell you, when I was coming along today, I was in a right old state, I think, but yeah, talking to you, I feel I owe it to myself. Susie, Maureen, and also, I don't know whether you are saying this, but you are kind of encouraging me that because I have been through all those things, I probably need to realize that and that I can probably help him, Guy. I mean, it's not just the little feelings in me of I may in my maturity rather than it be just being naughty. Whoa, 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 whoa. But it's not wrong to use your experience in life to understand other people. Susie, uh huh. Maureen, and I have just been so cut off and remote with my friends. Family needs have narrowed me apart from my interest to care. Susie, well, you have had a very difficult situation to manage. You have had from your account a long and happy marriage. Maureen, uh huh. Susie, and you have suffered a hell of a blow. Maureen, well, it's sort of like a living death. Susie, yeah, and it's almost like an act of desertion. Maureen, yes, you do feel. I felt he would walk away. That's the difficulty. It's the coldness of walking away. Susie, Maureen, they don't realize they look cold, but it's like walking down a road that you are not on, but you have still been trying to help them down the road. But they don't see you and it goes on and on and on. You get blamed sometimes for it. Susie, well, I suppose it's the terrible feeling of rejection when Tom went down that road, and on top of that, everybody having their opinions about what you should be doing. Maureen, yeah. Susie, and you getting a strong calling that you wanted to go dancing and you like studying, and maybe you will go out for a walk on the beach or dinner with Guy. Maureen, I couldn't. I couldn't even have admitted that to myself unless I had come here. And I tell you, I really resisted coming to somebody to tell me what to do. I didn't realize. I mean, I remember when my mother died, somebody said you ought to go to the Samaritans or go to a counselor to grieve. And this woman said, you're not grieving for your mother. And I thought, don't you tell me what to do. I felt quite angry. I felt I don't want to grieve, but I don't feel that now. Susie, but you found your way here, and maybe you would have done it without finding your way here. I think it is worth you remembering that the initiative to do things has come from you. Maureen, yes, yes. Susie, so you might be able to take this initiative. Maureen, yeah. Susie, so let's see, and I'll see you next week. Maureen, thank you. Thank you very much. Maureen's grace and her struggle have touched me considerably. She's less than a decade older than me, but because of the historical moment in which we both came of age, and of course our personal biographies and desires, she has had a very different life experience with children, husband, and mother occupying her main energy. My generation developed a critique of the emotional and psychological cost of being brought up to see oneself as primarily a midwife to the activities and needs of others. There was a hard won psychological struggle for many to dare to also answer to one's own personal needs. Maureen is coming to that now, and it is very moving to see her managing the pulls and guilt on the one hand and her desire to breathe a different air on the other. She is hardly abandoning the idea of doing emotional labor. She's seeing Guy as someone who can draw on her experience with being a carer who lost her mother and Tom, but she is also taking a delight, as am I, in her being able to pursue her intellectual, dancing, and loving interests. That brings us to the end of Case of Maureen. Afterwards, since that was the last case, I will be reading afterwards in this recording only. Or let me see. Afterward. The work of therapy is hidden and often invisible. People wonder what goes on in the room. Are therapists like the cabbie or hairdresser onto whom secrets are poured? Are we like the priest who hear confessions? Does therapy create a dependent relationship? Is it all just babble and self justification? Is it a way of absolving oneself of guilt and responsibility? As I hope I have shown, it is some of these things and none of them. In therapy, the opinions of the cabbie or a hairdresser are absent. The quiet attention of the priest may be present, but it is only the starting point. Dependency may exist for a period of time. Strange sounding phrases may be intermittently developed between the therapy couple. Guilt and responsibility get taken out of their rigid boxes, examined, and instead of being absolved, they may turn into other feelings or get reshaped. Therapy, like any specialist work, can seem odd to an onlooker. It has been my aim as a psychotherapist, when outside the consulting room, to show what is so fascinating and potentially life changing about the process and to apply the insights of therapy to the wider world. I have wanted to show that therapy is a different way of talking and a different way of hearing. Therapy is as much a listening cure as it is a talking cure. The fact of being heard and hearing one's word in a space in which they aren't necessarily interrupted or soothed but just hang means they can reverberate. The individual or the couple or the family hears whether the words that have emerged are the right words. They are brought face to face with what lives inside them but is hard to say. Like words chosen for a poem, the cutler of daily language is eviscerated. The words might need to be refined or they might shock the individual by being unexpected. Whatever they are, they carry a new weight. Slips of the tongue, of course, can have significance, but beyond that, and in a more ordinary sense, one discovers as one talks the things that are difficult, the feelings that are rushed over, ignored, or avoided, the words that resound, the silences, the ellipses, false starts, interruptions, and hesitations, which feature widely in the therapy, append the conventions of ordinary conversation. The patient, client, analysand, all unsatisfactory terms from my point of view, and thus I tend to use them interchangeably, enters the room. How she or he does it, whether she looks at the therapist or down at the floor or smiles or uses the same opening words such as "were a week," are all artifacts of the therapeutic encounter, as is the therapist's quiet welcome. Delight, a hug as a hello, a soothing arm around the back, common in friendship, are absent. In its place, the therapist conveys an intense interest in seeing the person. Her or his ears, heart, and body are open to what will unfold in the session, a session marked by time boundaries and usually occurring in the same place. Therapy psychoanalysis is a collaborative venture. Two people, analysand and analyst, patient or client and therapist, sit in a room together. It is a democratic process. The analysand initially drives the session because of what they bring, the way they set the conversation and the pace. As the relationship develops, the language that is created, the pauses, the reflections, the interjections of the therapist will uh, interjections of the therapist will be particular to each therapy relationship. Quite the opposite of psychobabble. The rule of therapy are there to create the conditions for the work of therapy to occur. They do not impose a similar shape or feel on each therapeutic couple. I'm not the same therapist with the 12 people we have met in this book. Each one of them evokes differing aspect of me, uniquely draws on part of my personality, taps on my heartstrings with their own tune, or the tune I make inside of myself in relation to them. The way I feel about each of them is distinctive. What I offered was specific to them. Therapy is a bespoke spoke craft. Therapy is a bespoke craft with each therapeutic pair or group creating novel circumstances to respond to. We met Richard and Lewis, a couple on the cusp of parenthood. They became they came because a distance had opened up in their relationship. Richard seemed to have disappeared into his work as a builder, and Louise, who had just taken a leave from her job as an event manager, felt abandoned and let down by Richard, a man she had adored until late in the pregnancy when the fact of the impending baby became obvious. Their need was for some rather urgent reconnecting with each other, albeit on different terms from the enchanted romance that enabled them to be carefree until recently. They are both engaging individuals, yet now disgruntled in their own bubbles. It's hard, except for brief moments, to feel what they have between them. Instead, I felt Lewis's urgency and Richard's reluctance. They pulled on me in opposite direction. I pondered whether the poles they expressed in the section we listened in on are important features of their relationship in general or specific to late pregnancy and early parenting, with its ensuing excitement and panic. I felt Lewis's frustration and Richard's annoyance and fear. I felt the tug between patience and impatience. I wanted Lewis to back off so that Richard could take up some space, but I'm aware of a dynamic between them in which Richard will continue to retreat if doesn't insist that he participate in their new adventure. He needs her to beckon him, and this is as true when their baby arrives as before. Therapy is an emotional journey for the therapist, not just for her patients. Sometimes, as we saw, it's a high wire act, as when John drops his unexpected bombshell. I'm on my toes, empathic, and touched, and trying to choreograph myself so that I don't puncture his dignity. Sometimes it calls for serenity and the simple wisdom of age, as with Helen, the young woman lawyer who has been in therapy for 24 months. I remember the feeling she is so flummoxed by and feel the relief that I am no longer plagued with her questions. I want to convey that the questions and dilemmas she has are exciting, but I need to be mindful that the experience of longevity can sound patronizing, which is not what I feel. I have been very moved by how her cancer diagnosis has shifted her into a new territory, not exclusively new, but sharpening her dilemmas. With Harriet, a school secretary in her 40s, I was asked to understand the most painful of losses and feelings of helplessness. I believe I was helping her with those feelings, but it will be a long haul. And looking despair in the eyes is not easy for either of us. With Jo, my compassion for her ineptitude mixes with exasperation as she unwittingly tests the boundaries of the therapeutic encounter whose conventions she does not yet know. And yes, I was so pleased she was able to come back and consider getting help. With Douglas, his desperation calls me to want to act. With Charles, I want to make him less suave and detached. With Natalie, I wanted to hold to want my own frustration of not yet understanding what she is up to. With Maureen, it's an easier call of straightforward empathy. With Amelia and Grace, I live in both positions as a mother and as a daughter. When I take someone on for therapy, I notice a somewhat peculiar process occurring inside me as I take a walk, or as I am doing the washing, or am on my way in a non work situation. Unprompted, I hear their speech patterns in my ear, or my body spontaneously imitates the way they move, hold their head, smile or grimace, and settle themselves in the therapy room. So with Jo, I heard where she placed the emphasis in a sentence, and I felt myself take on her winsome smile as though to find a way to make a space inside of me for her. When you offer yourself as a therapist to someone, you can't know how long the person will stay with you, but it could be for a considerable time. You are living their issues with them, and there is a way in which the intimacy that evolves requires me to open myself, my body, my ears, my eyes, my sense of smell, to fold them inside me. Their idioms impact on me from the outside and the inside. I'm not simply a technician of the mind's tributaries. My analysons get into my own bloodstreams of thought, feeling, and movement. Each person who comes to therapy needs the same thing: to be listened to be thought about, and to be heard in a private space, as well as something distinctive and personal. A harassed woman may require a sounding board to check that she isn't too critical of her children, but it must be offered in such a way that she doesn't experience my responses as adding to the burden. Therapy needs to open some mental territory where she can think anew and afresh. A 50-year-old man sent to boarding school at 7 when his parents divorced wants me as an approving, appreciative mother figure. I feel it, but I know he can't have me as an ideal replacement. The grief he feels for his early disillusionments and loss will not be healed by a better version of mum, however seductive and cozy that feels. At 24 years old, young woman wants me to be more distant version of her very capable but from her perspective slightly invasive mother. I have to see my own self as someone who can respond to what she needs without undermining her mother. The couple who needs to see that the very things that annoy them in each other are the part of themselves they like to disavow reminds me of how a third person, the therapist, can tell the conversation to enable them to reknit their intimacy. The academically driven professor for whom feelings cause her difficulty has to be persuaded of the intellectual reasons for why emotions might be of value and why and why risking experiencing them with me will be useful. She likes to tussle and wants me to tussle back, and I do. It's the way to reach her, but it wouldn't suit many people. A man in an aggressive struggle with his stepson needs to know how his actions can have a positive outcome rather than a negative one. His reported conversation make me wretch inside, and the struggle to offer him an alternative puts me in a teacher situation. Each individual who comes for help craves acceptance, even though they may be different or even tetchy. Knowing that craving provides me with the motivation to get underneath and behind the cruelties and difficulties that I am hearing about, some of which will be thrown at me unexpectedly. How can I be useful? What am I being asked to do? Who am I a proxy for? What will enable my patient to clear the space around them and consider something from a different perspective? How can I parse their feelings so that they increase their emotional repertoire rather than repeatedly play the same no longer productive song? Such are the demands of the consulting room and what gets stirred up in the therapist. The psychoanalyst analytic session always has had a strong aesthetic for me. It is a practice like the work of painting or working or composing or dancing or working on a scientific problem. It requires knowledge which constantly refreshes itself. It requires expertise and it requires an ear to shape, feel, and touch the heart of the issue so that they can be revisioned. At the same time, there is physical aesthetic, by which I mean the resonance and rhythm of a session, how noisy it is, the weight of the silences, the relationship between therapeutic dialogue and reflectiveness, the way the bodies in the room move forward and back into the shaped, shared space in response to intensity. In Richard and Lewis's session, I felt an urgency to quiet the noise. I wanted to clear the jangle in my ears and slow the language into a different register. The jangle I experienced is an unthought out signal that the contact between them needed reshaping. There is a prosody in their dialogue when each one talks without listening. Richard, you're more interested in my mum than you are in me. Louis, well, your mum's very helpful. Richard, she used to hate mum before she couldn't stand mum coming around. Louis, I didn't hate your mum. Or take my dialogue with Natalie, in which reading this back I can see I'd copy her rhythm. Natalie, I can't keep seeing Christopher. I can't keep doing that. I have to stop that. Susie, and if you imagine stopping seeing Christopher, What constitutes the aesthetic of psychoanalytic therapy is harder to pin down. The aesthetic is not to do with harmony because it can be decidedly unharmonious. I think it is probably to do with the struggle for truth, a provisional truth to be sure, but an honesty to engage in a venture which presents itself like a mess of rubbish with no coherence except for its capacity to make the individual feel helpless and hopeless. Through a process of clearing and examining what needs repairing, what needs sorting, what needs protecting, what needs discarding, what needs nurturing, and in what order these things can be done, constitute an aesthetic marked by rhythm and timbre, by the idiom established in each analyst and analysand couple, and by the pacing. Something beautiful evolves at both a psychological and spiritual level. Therapy is a deep practice. It searches for veracity. One truth can open to another, which may shade what is first understood. The intricate construction of the human mind shift during the course of therapy, being a participant observer to the changing of internal structures and of the expansion of feeling is very satisfying. Seeing how defenses are used and how they can be worked around and in time dissolve has a beauty which is perhaps akin to the mathematician or physicist experience of finding an equation elegant. I find the particulars of learning how an individual's internal world works fascinating. We are always learning, we all split parts of experiences off, like Natalie and Harriet and Charles. We all forget, we all protect ourselves against certain ideas and feelings. We do this because if we remembered and felt everything, there wouldn't be much psychic space for the present. While psychoanalysts theorize our ways of understanding the mind and the body, the work of brain scientist and neuropsychologist is dovetailing what we discover in the consulting room. As we understand the compelling nature of the pull to repeat what may ill serve us, so the neuroscientists are attempting to plot the ways in which the mind prunes and shapes experience through repeated actions and beliefs. All three disciplines confirm the evidence that the essence of the human is the consequence of a long learning outside the womb. We don't arrive knowing how to walk and talk and think or feel. We arrive with the capacity to do so, and we apprehend specifically how, in the context of the relationship which receive us, those relationships embedded in time, place, and economic circumstances, then structure our mind, our feelings, our brain, our desires, our behaviors, and the way we are embodied. Therapy takes so very long because the structures of mind we develop in infancy, childhood, and adolescence are quasi material structures. They are who we are, and although the human mind and brain have great plasticity, desired change can be very difficult. Psychoanalytic therapy, with its emphasis on looking behind our defense structure to the beliefs and feelings that can appear dangerous or unknown, involves the therapist serving as an external anchor, hence the caricature of being overdependent on the analyst. While the work of deconstructing and reconstructing follows, in therapy you don't just learn a new language to add to your repertoire. You relinquish unhelpful parts of the mother tongue towards the and weave them together with the knowledge of a new grammar. The curiosity a therapist has towards the analysis on structure designate us as anthropologist of the mind. Each individual mind embodies complex understanding of social relationships, the interplay between self, what is allowed and what is sequestered, and what to do with what isn't allowed. To know an individual is to know some of their time in history, in place, in class, in gender, caste, race, and the society and family constellation they have emerged from. An individual is the outcome of her or his engagement with others from birth, and some would argue the womb onwards. As we unlearn and remake, so we impact on those we are close with. We all know this in matter of fact way. A bully can intimidate. An easy, confident person can make us feel included and capable. A puffed up show off can make us feel competitive. Our minds are both resilient and flexible. We can explain Stockholm Syndrome or the affection built up for an abuser by the mind's capacity to make accommodations to need. In therapy, however, the way one mind has an impact on another becomes part of the subject of the therapy. This makes for an intensity and truth seeking which forms part of the aesthetic. So, what differences does therapy make? Why should someone come? Does everyone need to come? Many live with painful family secrets which can erupt at Christmas or when the family gets together. Many live with unease or are beset by symptoms that intensify. Many feel an emptiness or a confusion about why they can't activate their desires or why they sabotage the things they imagine they want. For others, their relationships unravel and devastate them and they don't know why. Richard, Lois, Harriet, Helen, Joe, Joan, Emilia, Natalie, and Charles were in difficulty. That's why they came. For Maureen and Douglas, talking with family or friends had not reached the places that could help them sufficiently. John tells movingly of the aliveness that he now feels as though before he was walking through life not living it. He's not alive because he's fallen for me. He's alive because he's fallen for himself. Yes, love can look like the catalyst, but a more important catalyst was my being deeply interested in him. He found a way to open himself up. He began to see himself as being of value to himself and to me. The negative self image he carried didn't just dissolve, to work he would have to work to he had to work hard not to slot the attention he's been receiving into a set of categories that nullified it. She's just doing her job, true, but nevertheless, what makes her for the healing? Or if I show her it is affecting me, she will have power over me. And he had to risk being vulnerable to me in order to change himself inside. Love, of course, does do that temporarily. Allows us to see ourselves differently because we are loved and do love. But if love itself isn't sufficient for change because the patterns that hurt can be stimulated in a new relationship, then therapy can be of profound help. With Harriet, therapy is about addressing a present wound that has activated a previous loss that ruptured everything she knew about life. She didn't just lose her father, she lost her mother too, because despite her mother being with her, she was divorced from her own home and community. The bereft mother conveyed a resigned attitude about getting on with life, which left a depressive hole in Harriet, which she coped with well enough until the failures of the IVF and her own flight from her partner. Harriet's present loss is allowing her to face the earlier loss from which she cut off as she turned herself into the nice girl who could try to fit in. Her earlier depressive disposition will clear. It will become reconstituted as a loss and that will restore something that she's been missing without knowing it. Listening to Helen, we hear her desire to understand the meaning of life. It's a big question which will be made up of many small answers. When I say that we are working to rearrange Helen's internal furniture, I mean that the structures of her psyche need to be reorganized so that she can discover what she wants and join it up with an emerging Helen inside of herself. Such changes won't be easily integrated in the first instance. They involve reconsidering her job, her boyfriend, her relationship to her parents, her health, and her interest as she struggles to expand herself from the inside out, and not through her accomplishments. Doing so, as we have seen with the cancer scare, is giving her a time of cushioning and the desire for a life of meaning. It won't be without sadness, sorrow, or disappointment, for those are parts of life, but she will have embodied Freud's famous dictum to move from hysteria to ordinary human unhappiness. Helen has similarities with several young women that I have seen in my practice over the last 20 years or so. They share a sense of having fulfilled their dreams by getting good jobs, nice enough housing, boyfriends, looking great, being very social, and living a metropolitan life. The heartbreak for me is that this is a generation of women who, while they have grown up with the promise that the world is their oyster, have often not had the emotional support to implement it psychologically. Their teacher and parents have told them they can go far and have held open the door and applauded them. So what do I mean when I say they haven't had the emotional support? The ability to jump through hoops and overcome obstacles has been expected, while conflicts and fears they feel about advancing are not really addressed. As feminism is in the noughties moved out of political discourse, it was replaced by a bizarre assumption that women, and indeed men, can have it all if they tick the right boxes. The importance of conversations about what it meant to be breaking new ground has been replaced by an over optimistic and individualistically focused, you can do it philosophy where success is measured by position, money, advancement, looks, and an externally positive attitude. Paradoxically, the very processes and conversations that enabled women in the 1970s to dare to take up new possibilities, the support from contemporaries, and the understanding that such daring was both hard and exhilarating, was either not known about by the next generation of parents or was deemed unnecessary since they themselves hadn't gone through it and the world had appeared to open up. The bequeathing of ambition, often by mothers like Helen, who had not pursued her own, was loving, but it may have been an ambition which denied the fear or the struggles there might be at a psychological level. Thus, the complexity of what the young women were engaging with was often hijacked by them finding the next mountain to climb rather than acknowledging the difficulties they would or could encounter inside their head and hearts. The internal voices or conflicts would be silenced rather than have room to breathe and in time dissipate. And this has added to Helen's plaintive words. What is the point? And I suppose I feel lonely quite a lot of time. In this sense, I feel excited that Helen is asking questions about existence and recognizing her inner loneliness. It is a good prognosis for her to put her inner life and her outward achievements together. D.W. Winnicott, a psychoanalyst and pediatrician, understood very deeply the problem of internal alienation. He called this dilemma the false self. He saw the true self as an undeveloped part that had not been nourished into life. He proposed that when the main parent, usually the mother, is unable to see and respond to the desire of the child, the true self goes underground. Resourcefully, the child then finds those aspects that the mother can respond to. This makes the mother feel good in what she is then able to give, and the child feels good that he or she has mother's approval and attention. As the pattern of pleasing continues, the true self fails to come alive and be real for the individual, and she lives by the compensation the false self can garner. The false self has many attributes and can serve the person well up to a point. Then a chasm between the search for the next challenge and a nourishing life can open up. Helen got to that point, which is why she sought therapy. In her therapy, we have been working to understand the false self organization as she tentatively invites the dormant true self to peek above the parapet so that she can get to know her. In time, the false self, which is better called an adapted self, will join up with the true self, which is better called a more authentic Helen. She will be enriched and feel she has herself with herself. Helen has grown up at a time of enormous social change in Britain. Most of the social democratic values that shaped the world after the Second World War have been slowly dismantled. Consumerism, the notion of the individual as a brand, and the prevalence of digital life and social media have changed the terms of growing up, especially for young people who have economic resources. The focus on individualism and making it, doing it, being it, selling it is new. Life can turn into a performance. I have encountered several young women who come in saying their lives are devoid of meaning and purpose. They say that everything is going well on the surface, but they feel lost and empty. They have rituals they subscribe to, either around eating or not eating, going to the gym, meditating, socializing, lubricated by alcohol and cocaine, which they see as crucial. They are digital natives who live with medium level anxiety a great deal of the time. If we put together the social change with the psychological difficulties this intensifies, we should take seriously the empty feelings many are expressing as an indicator of social and personal malaise. Jo presented us with a different dilemma. She came because her friend had told her to. She's lost. Her acting different roles gave her ways to imagine and play a life, but not enough grounding to find truth for herself. Her bubbly, pleasing persona is shielding a more desperate stance, which therapy will be able to address so that she can stop bobbing around and find what she needs to know about herself in future. Her courage in returning and not running away from herself and her very real difficulties is hopeful. She's been dealt a difficult hand and she's trying not to flee from it. Richard and Louis have had quite some readjusting to do. Becoming parents is an opportunity for each of them to create a present they both can live in with their boy rather than repeat their history and the history of their parents. And this is a salient fact of therapy. That history can be in the past and rather than unknowingly casting its ball over the present, The past acknowledged allows for a richer, layered, and less fearful present. Amelia and Grace are shifting their relationship as Grace is coming into young adulthood. It's fraught and tricky, and both the roles of the parent and the role of being a teenager have dramatically transformed since Amelia was young. Fortunately, their good humor is allowing them to find a new way of being together and a new way of talking. Douglas, forced to examine how his private life is interrupting his professional competence as a judge, finds a route into compassion for himself. Charles' nonchalance has been threatened and he faces some challenging encounters with his wife, his partner, and his son. Natalie has to tolerate being confused until she can link up the bits of herself that have been compartmentalized. With Maureen, we see her struggling with the end of one kind of life and the risk of opening up to another in which her personal desires are more apparent. Accompanying each of these characters is a joy. But I haven't answered the questions of whether therapy is for everyone. For me, the answer is no. Therapy is one kind of vector into that wonderful adventure and examined life. It is an intimate and delicate route, but makes little sense unless one is in a psychological trouble. Yes, we can all benefit from becoming emotionally literate, and social programs which help expectant parents, educators, doctors, nurses, and so on expand their emotional knowledge are effective ways to enable us to know ourselves, to connect well with ourselves, and be all right in our own skin. For others, art, literature, bonding through sport, political or spiritual activity, satisfying enough work, and so on will provide meaning. But it is an arduous struggle in a time of political cruelty, which wreaks extreme economic and social division while despoiling our environment and creating division inside us. Many live lives of quiet desperation. As Henry David Thoreau told us in Walden, therapy cannot answer these ills on its own. Psychoanalytic ways of thinking have much to bring to public policy and the political conversation, whether about the family, child development, bonding, body image, emotional collapse, unwanted teenager pregnancy, repeat offenders, gangs, violent or abusive relationship, attachment difficulties, compulsive eating or not eating, smoking and cutting, alienation, wars, fears of immigration and turning group of people into others, and so on. In a time of fake facts and the drive to oversimplification, complexity of analysis is imperative. Like other disciplines such as sociology, economics, and social psychology, psychoanalytic thinking should have a place at public policy table as it is its insights speak to the mismatch between people's inner and outer experience, the gap between what they say and what they feel, which no other discipline addresses. Psychoanalysis studies people in the process of change, illuminating unexpected reason and motivations, which, if understood, could lead policymakers to different emphasis as they try to effect wanted social change. In this sense, psychoanalytic thinking as a technocratic discipline has something to bring to the table alongside other analytic methods, not in the way of the behavioral economics with its notion of nudge. Psychoanalytic prompts are, in a sense, anti directive and thus expansive. Psychoanalysis can never supplant other forms of research, but it can enrich them. Symptoms of distress in our society are exacerbated by changes in global culture and the development of rampant consumerism, which is itself a pointer to the horrors of ordinary needs for connection and contribution not met. We are invited to participate in society by taking up identity markers such as brands and viewing ourselves as a brand. A sense of belonging is fostered by purchasing, but its falsity fails to satisfy. So, too, are fundamentalist modes of thought, whether they are xenophobias, nationalism, racism, or gender hatreds. In fundamentalist modes of thought, only a narrow band of feelings can be tolerated, and solutions to injustices are expressed through adherence to political, sectarian, and religious party lines, which have a hard time with complexity. They abhor internal dissent while thriving on external disagreement. What consumerism and fundamentalism both highlight is the human desperation to belong. This is not pathological. The desperation to belong is what makes us human. When we belong, we can feel safe being separate. We need separated attachment. If we don't, the expression we find for it when it goes awry can be deadly, and it is part of what besets global culture today, the promise yet often impossibility of belonging. So, therapy for everyone? I say no, but therapeutic ideas to enter social discourse? I say yes. We don't and can't fully know ourselves. That is a conceit to protect us from feeling vulnerable and helpless. Much of what we do and how we go about it is unconscious. Therapeutic ideas can't make us fully conscious, but they can make us less arrogant and more humble in a generous manner about what it means to be human and to live. Like literature, psychoanalysis reveals the commonality of human experience by drilling into the particularities of the individual. The way an individual imagines and projects, the way the individual reads and misreads the situation speaks to us in our own private struggles. A highly personal and specific story unfolds to reveal common human themes. As we unpick what drives each of their behaviors, we come across the human search for secure attachment and recognition and the ways in which that search becomes derailed. We know about this. It's why we cry at the cinema when the lovers come together. We understand that longing. We feel that longing. We may crave that belonging. The specific tells the general, and so it is with psychotherapy. Each story tells us about the individual or the couple while it tells us about ourselves. We want to know about others' struggles because we want to know more deeply about ourselves and the project of being human. True. Well, I thought she derailed in between, but yeah, that brings us to the end of the book. In Therapy by Susie Orbach. Do write feedback for this book. I would love to know what you think about the reading, what the content was about, and how you felt about it. If any particular case you liked, I would love to know. Uh, and of course, if you have not subscribed to the channel and you like the content, do subscribe, like, and share. You can give recommendations of the next book to read. If you have any favorites or something that you are planning to read and you can't find the audiobook for it, you can tell me. I will read it and make an audiobook for you. Yes. Bye bye for now. I'll end and keep reading. Bye bye. Take care. You can reach out to me on YouTube, in the comment section of the video you're viewing, or in the community section. Bye.